I'm so tired of people saying that it's just a movie, it's just a comic book, it's just a TV show. No, it's not. Stories are the building blocks of our culture, of ourselves, even of our own psychology. We are a product of the stories we tell ourselves about our own past and the experiences on a daily basis, but also the stories that we choose to spend time with. What types of values or feelings or whatever are they promoting? What types that we like to spend our time around? They're going to shape us. They're going to shape our personality and character, and they're going to shape our perception of the world and the acts and behaviors that we put out into the world. And people don't understand that. They go, it's just a movie. It's just this. I can like and promote whatever I want. Well, of course you can, but you should pay attention to the responsibility that you have.
Consume stories responsibly.
As a member of society, as a human being, responsibility to yourself.
Consider the consequences.
You need some balance. You need some certain criteria that is going to make sure you're promoting the right kind of works, or at least have thought through the type of work that this or that story is going to do in our culture, and then make your own decision whether or not that's something you want to support.
Consume stories responsibly. Consider the consequences. Consume stories responsibly.
There we go. I was like, what's going on? What's going on? Okay, I got it. Got it fixed. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Professor Geek, and welcome to another live stream. Hope you guys had a good week. I'm looking forward to this one. You guys have been asking for Dracula for a while, so we are finally here to talk about Dracula. Maybe it's just the angle of the ceiling, but it just seems. I guess it's okay. So hopefully you're all doing well. Do want to brag about my wife buying me Count Dracula the other day. Finally in stores. Pretty psyched about that. Move my notes here to where you actually start talking. I know, I'm so excited for Final Fantasy fan. I got my. I don't really drink milk because I get a little lactose intolerant. So I've got my vanilla almond milk, which I am going to probably tear through a couple of bowls. Probably feel pretty miserable afterwards. But it's so good while I'm eating it. So let me go ahead and welcome the chat here. Good to see you, Nathaniel's Lowsball, Ghost Planet Max Inc., Eldridge Fan. Eldridge Fan's pointing out that I didn't know that. Thanks for pointing it out. That Gothic, the movie, the Ken Russell film Gothic I was talking about, is free on Tubi. It's cool. Big Al Presents popping in to say hi, giving us a quote, Jonathan Harper quote. Appreciate that. Praetor 7, Electric Barbarella, great to see you there. The Imaginative Hobbyist, Samuel Proctor. Lots of quotes coming through like that. Leia Plus Size, Darth Enigma, welcome. Crystal Ashes, and of course my dear sweet sound engraver, who is pointing out that she started to read, started her reading of Universal Monsters. She started with Frankenstein the other day. She's just breaking into it, so it's pretty cool. Yeah. My mic is coming in and out. Okay. Let me know if it's still like that. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just me turning around with the mic or something. I don't know. Did you guys hear the same thing out in the chat? Let me know. Sound engraver is very good at picking stuff up like that. She's got the ears for it. So let me know if the mic sounds like it's coming in and out. Oh yeah, Leia Plus Size did too. All right, give me 1 second. Let me just good thing we figure this out now before it check. All right, the mic's coming through there. Let me just maybe I just need to stay right up on it, like usual. I don't know. Tell me if this makes any kind of difference there. Sounds like I'm talking underwater, says Darth. Well, that's not good. Who wants to talk underwater? On the right mic, I can turn. Let me see. No difference. All right. StreamYard every now and then will go in and just reset settings that I've changed. I'm just changing some things around here. That
Let's see. I can reduce mic background noise. I don't know. I'll click on that and see. You guys let me know if you see any change or hear any change or whatever. We will figure it out. Oh, Sound Engraver says that's better. Much better. Okay. Then and what that is somehow it's echo cancellation was turned on in StreamYard. I've never turned on echo cancellation. Never. And that's really annoying that StreamYard will just go through and just change settings on you. Just update it or reboot them or something like that. That ticks me off. I've never clicked on echo cancellation, and they're going to do it every single time. So thanks for letting me know, Madeira, and other people in the chat who pointed that out as well. And good. So now we can hear each other, or I can hear you can hear me rather. Okay. All right. Where was I? I think I'd welcomed everybody. I don't know. Do want to show off one more thing here before I get started. Just received this in the mail. I had ordered it like last Halloween or last fall-ish, and it had come out in individual issues, and they finally put it together and they released it. They were just putting it together in a nice hardback. This is Matt Wagner and Tim Kelly. Not Kelly Jones, sorry. Tim Kelly's the guitarist for Slaughter. Getting my Kellys mixed up. Dracula. It's really sweet. I haven't started reading it yet, but I think I'm going to save this for my review on the next episode of Iconicast. But it's a prequel to the novel. It's sort of the origins of Dracula. And Matt Wagner and Kelly Jones are two of the, these guys are legends, comic artists. And Matt Wagner, of course, has written some great stuff. So I'm excited about that. Yeah, sweet cover and everything. Yeah. All right. So... a couple of questions that I just wanted to cover before I got sidetracked. I mean, I'm glad I got sidetracked with the audio. I'm glad we were able to fix it. Sound Engraver was, or Leia Plus Size was asking Sound Engraver if we were going to be going to the Universal Dark attraction at the theme park. It opens this opened this fall. I did not know that. The Universals, huh? This fall will probably be too early for us to go, but the answer is yes. Don't listen to Sound Engraver. She's definitely going with me. I think that's what you're talking about, Universal Dark Attraction. Yeah, I am desperate to go. I've been reading and following the because Universal also has Nintendo World, which Sound Engraver will flip and love. Now I wouldn't expect her to go any of the scarier things with me, but the Universal Land, the Dark Universe Land, there is going to be something that's going to be family friendly. They've got like a restaurant, a vampire restaurant, where the steaks are served on a wooden stake, stuff like that. It's supposed to have all kinds of cool rides, so I'm really excited about it. This fall, probably not. It might be next year that we'll plan for it, save for it, but man, I'm excited about that. Fan Man wants to go too. It'd be great to meet him and his wife there. All right. We'll get to the Invisible Man, Nathaniel's Lowsball. We're going to stick with these three. I'm going to thoroughly cover the three main archetypes. Who are the three main ones, but we'll get there. Welcome to Michael Skimbody. Something about Todd Phillips and the Joker. Samuel Proctor, if I hadn't welcomed you there. All right. So let's go ahead and break into this. Get my notes here. One thing I'll say, this is, I'm now talking, tonight we're actually going to talk about the Dracula novel. Bram Stoker's Dracula, which truly is a masterpiece. I love Frankenstein and I love Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I think they are literary canon. I mean, you have to read those works. And I think there are elements of them that are masterful. But Dracula truly is it's a literary masterpiece. And it's one of my top 5 favorite novels. It's so well done. Thematically, structurally, it's just, and it's fun to read. Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I think it's important to read, and I'm enjoying it the first time through. But Frankenstein for me isn't really something I want to go back and read all that often. Maybe like once every 5 years, 10 years, at least by every 10 years. But 5 years maybe. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde is fascinating, maybe every 5 years. Dracula I could read once every year. It's just so fun. Now I don't really quite read, maybe once every other year. Once a year is kind of quick for anything. But it's just such a fun novel because it knows how to tell the story at a right pace. It knows how to tell the story in an interesting way. It creates this villain who's incredibly dangerous, incredibly challenging. How are our heroes ever going to overcome this freaking powerful villain, this Dracula? And he'd never let you feel hopeless though, because you love these characters so much who've come together to form this sort of band that as Van Helsing says, in one of the movies, especially we've all become God's madmen, but going after and it's just you're rooting for them the whole time. It's and I'm always pulling something new out of it every time I read it as well, because it's very dense, it's packed, it's just a lot of great things in it. So we'll talk about that as we move forward. Eldritch Fan for 199 Super Chat there says, what devil or witch was ever so great as Attila? I think that's you do give me another Lovecraft quote there. I'm trying to look at the chat there to see. Or do you mean the historical figure Attila the Hun? One thing I'll say before we get started on the content and the things I've prepared is this. I love that you guys are interested in this stuff. I really do. I'm having a blast talking about it. You guys seem to be, loving it. And I think that for the most part, those of you who are here are here because you're interested in the work. You're interested in Dracula. You're interested in Frankenstein and so forth. And that's great. That is great. I just want to caution you this, though. Anytime you're interested in a work and you want to learn more about it, this seems like common sense to say, go to the work, right? Go to Dracula. Read Dracula. Read it again. Read it 3 or 4 times. That's where you're going to find most of your information. That's where you're going to get most of your insights, is by reading and thinking about the primary text. Now, secondary sources are important, right? Me talking to you about it, the information I'm going to give you tonight is I'm a secondary source. I'm not the novel itself. I'm a secondary source. But this is just kind of like a little bit of a mini vent for academics, because I am a college professor. I do scholarship. I research. I mean, if you get a terminal degree at all in the humanities, then you kind of have to become a professional researcher. But I absolutely hate academics. I really do. They're just loathsome for all of the great work and ideas and information you can get from them. And I'm not saying every individual academic is horrible and I can't stand every single one of them. Obviously, I use myself, some of them as sources and whatnot. But it's such a problem. I was doing a little extra research for, giving this presentation and whatnot. And the problem with academics, pardon my language, but this is truly the best way to describe academics. They're what they do. The academics exist. It's just a big ivory tower circle jerk. That's just the best way to explain it. They read other academics. They write for other academics. And it's just this little incestuous dwindling of knowledge and of a narrowing of viewpoints and a narrowing of anything. And critical theory is a huge problem in it. I've talked about critical theory already. And it's just so frustrating. Like Christopher Frayling, he's the guy to go to if you want to talk about Dracula in terms of a scholar, a specialist, whatever. He's legendary. He's written a bunch of stuff. He's done, great, given many talks, many works, and he's great. He's got a lot of great stuff to say about it. But I heard him once talk about, we're going to talk about this dream that Bram Stoker had. And he said, yeah, clearly this was Bram Stoker's conflicting sexualities, a conflicting, with a latent homosexual. I'm like, what are you talking about? That makes no sense. It makes no sense with the dream you're talking about. You'll see when I get to it in a second. It makes no sense with the context of the age, context of his life. But if you're an academic and you've had to publish and hold and build a career around the prevailing critical theories, then queer theory is right there. Anytime Anytime another male character smiles at another male character in literature, oh, they're probably gay. This is the idiotic mindset that makes people think Samwise and Frodo are gay. Oh, they were really at a, no, shut up. It's that can be in a text, but make an actual case for it. Don't just try to read it into everything, which is what a queer theorist does. That's what they rub their nipples over all day long. Is just trying to pretend that everybody's gay. Same thing with a Marxist theorist. Every single work out there is about the plight of the underclass. And shut up, gosh, ugh. So a lot of the problem is that academics spend so much time reading each other and trying to build on the other person's ideas. And again, they're all pulling from the same pile of blocks. So it's just everything looks the same, everything sounds the same. They're not actually saying anything new. And the place to go to understand work is to the actual work itself. Spend way more time on the primary text. That's just and it comes to the problem. If you're going to find, I thank God for academics like Joseph Pierce. He's really great because he loves the literature. And I'm not just saying that because he's a Catholic. E. Michael Jones is a Catholic, and he said some wonderful stuff. I use a lot of stuff from his scholarship. I'll use some stuff from his scholarship tonight, but he's got a little bit of that academic in him, and he says some weird things about Dracula. He's like, it's nothing but a syphilitic allegory. He's like, what? No. There's something interesting to that, but it's way more than that, But somebody like Joseph Pierce, I like because he writes plenty of non-academic work for people who, like him, still love the literature. And that's what a lot of academics pretend that they pride themselves in the fact that we no longer love the literature. That's an amateur. We are, professionals. No, you're limiting your mindset. You're narrowing your pool of knowledge here and everything. So anyway, sorry, rant over. We'll get to the actual text here and what I've got prepared here in a moment. But another super chat from Eldritch Fan I'll catch before I get through anymore. Thank you so much, Eldritch Fan. Said, in the other universals, the monster is the star. Dracula's Van Helsing was the only hero who could be a star, and MC you want to follow on adventures. Main character you want to follow on adventures. Yeah, Dracula still is he is the hero of the movie in terms of protagonist. We start with Renfield, who meets Dracula, and then we follow Dracula and Renfield over, but we're really following Dracula protagonist-wise. But you're right. Van Helsing, what a wonderful character. And the Van Helsing in that Universal Monsters film is wonderful. I forget the actor right off the name. Sloan. Joseph Sloan? Something Sloan. Great actor, great portrayal of him. And what amazing character in the text. We're going to talk about that a little bit here tonight as well. I don't know how far we'll get with this tonight. Dracula, as I said, is such a huge novel. It might very well be that this is a two-parter. I might get through part of it tonight, and we might just say, let's finish up next week, because there's a lot to say about it. But first, we should cover some of the background in terms of understanding the context that Dracula came from, because that's part of what I've been doing with this series, is looking at the history, looking at the ideas that are about there, and where does the idea of this incredibly iconic monster come from? Where does it come from? What culture and what philosophies? Because it's still with us today. And one of the things I pointed out, and this is something that E. Michael Jones talks about a lot, is and I've kind of pulled the term monsters of the Enlightenment from this idea. We talked about Frankenstein and how if we didn't have the Enlightenment going on, we never would have had Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is a great reflection on the dangers of and the victimizations, the way it victimizes people of Enlightenment thinking, taken to its extreme, certainly in Europe and France and so forth. And Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we talked about last time, that came between these two novels, is still with that Enlightenment. One thing about the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when that was written, there was starting to be, especially in Britain, a heavy mistrust of doctors. Doctors were still doing the grave robbing and whatnot, so they could learn anatomy and stuff, but they would also subject people to a lot of indignities. Women who were suspected of, we'll talk about syphilis. Syphilis was a big deal. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, it's in the culture. syphilis, we don't think about it much today or really understand it, how big of a deal it was back then, because we have such a short cultural memory. I mean, we don't really, the average person today, or especially if you're a Gen Zer, you don't really realize how much of a big deal AIDS was back in the day. I mean, AIDS was a terrifying thing. Everybody, and there was all these stories about how you could get AIDS, and was it just from using a toilet seat that somebody had been on? I mean, just all kinds of things. And as soon as there was not necessarily a cure for AIDS, but as soon as treatments and whatnot became to where AIDS wasn't just an absolute death sentence, it just sort of fades from memory. People don't realize how much of a cultural fear it is. Well, syphilis was the big deal back then before antibiotics and everything, and it was a ugly, ugly disease. And you got it through sex, and it was it would eat away at your face, it would eat away at your mind, it would eat away obviously at the genitals, but just your skin in general. I mean, it was a horrifying, monstrous disease. It was quite horrible. And this is something that women who were suspected of being prostitutes at one time in England could be subject to enforced exams by doctors. Obviously very intimate exams. Expecting their genitalia and whatnot and the stuff and everything. So it's science trying to keep up, or in the medical field trying to keep up with some of the dangers out there. And I'm kind of all over the place, getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I'm still trying to lay the groundwork. This was something that we saw with Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where you've got the Enlightenment becoming what it's going to be in the Victorian era in England, which is a little more, you can't say Victorian era without saying repression. Yes, repression existed, but that's not the be-all and end-all of the Victorian era. There was a lot of great things about the Victorian era, some of the work that came out, of course. And this is where we are with Bram Stoker's Dracula. One of the things about it, there's a significant change. E. Michael Jones talks about this, where think about Frankenstein's time in terms of the Enlightenment. They had just had Newton. It was a time of a looking at physics in terms of the science. Galvanism, the lightning. We talked about that with Frankenstein. By the time we have Dracula here, we've had Darwin and the Origin of the Species come out. And if you're of the Enlightenment mindset, where you're trying to sort of replace God with science anyway, then Darwin is just the biggest Christmas gift to you ever, because the idea of the survival of the fittest, which comes out of social Darwinism. A lot of people don't realize how much the lines were blurred between Darwinism and social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, if you don't know, is the idea, okay, well, like if we're going to believe that humanity evolved from previous, animals and species and so forth, there's an evolution of the species, and it's just what we are now as human beings. If you believe that, then that happens by the fittest one, or the one who's able to achieve survival, survives. And sometimes it can be luck, sometimes it can be random or whatever, but the idea of survival of the fittest came about, where the one who's the fittest to survive comes about, and they're the ones that survive. Well, why not do that socially as well as biologically? Meaning that, hey, look, if you're lower class and you're starving, well, maybe you deserve to starve so you can die off, because you're clearly not the kind of person that can, become a productive member of society and that kind of idea. So social Darwinism was a real, truly evil. And a lot of people just saying the word Darwinism meant social Darwinism as well as Darwinism, in terms of evolution and everything like that. So this was going on in the day. Not everybody believed it, but it's something that's going on in the day. That, with the idea of syphilis, a lot of the cholera epidemic, a lot of the sicknesses that are coming about, there's a shift from looking at like the physics of things to the biology of things in terms of the Enlightenment science. So we go from Newton to Darwin. We go from Prometheus, which was such a big heroic character. We talked about Prometheus a few weeks ago with Frankenstein being subtitled A Modern Prometheus. And we talked about the mythological figure. Percy Shelley had written, Prometheus Unbound, which was a riff on Prometheus Bound. It was a a popular character, a figure of the day, because the idea of the Enlightenment was one of us we can harness these ideals as writers and bring down the new divinity of the gods to man. We can do this. And there are scholars that talk about, or historians that talk about, Daedalus being the far more um, interesting or popular character by the time we get to the Victorian era, because if there's if it's in the blood, if it's in our genetics, then we can engineer it ourselves. We don't need to bring down Olympus to Earth. We could evolve into Olympus ourselves if we just get rid of the infections and perfect our species, like that. So it's a heady topic. You can talk a lot more about it. I didn't explain it incredibly well just now, but that's some of the background that I'm trying to lay here. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want to keep working ahead. So Bram Stoker is born into this era. He's born in Ireland. As a child, Bram Stoker is very sickly. They don't know exactly what illness he had. It was a very prolonged illness. Now, he eventually did get over it. He's not like Robert Louis Stevenson, who dealt with that lung issue all of his life. Bram Stoker did get over it. He licked it, and he was an athlete in college and all of this stuff. But as a child, he was very sickly. Doctors would have been seeing him all the time. Doctors did still bleed sometimes back then. They bled you. So you can imagine Bram Stoker, this little helpless child in bed, and these doctors, these men leaning over him and taking his blood. I mean, there's some imagery there, right, that might show up in later work. His mother had also, and this is, we know this from his notes and his journals and whatnot, his mother would tell him stories about her living through the cholera epidemic, which was in a different part of Ireland that she had grown up in. And the cholera epidemic was a big deal. I mean, Sligo, if I'm pronouncing I didn't look up the right pronunciation of my Irish cities, but she would talk about and describe people walking around the city as just the walking dead. I mean, just the walking dead walking around this, so the walking undead, kind of, dying of cholera. It was everywhere in the city. She talked about at one point where she was trying to escape, and she and some other people, Stoker's mother, she would tell him the story, piled into this black coach, and they were driving to Dublin, I think, trying to escape the epidemic. And it was this black coach. People were afraid of the black coach because people knew that there was sickness inside. They were terrified of them, and they wouldn't let the black coach in. It was this mad dash to get into the city, and they wouldn't let them in the city because of fear of the plague or whatever like that inside the coach. And this idea of a mad dash of the black coach can be seen beginning of Dracula, but certainly towards the end, when they're on the Dracula's tail and trying to, on his trail and trying to, hunt him down. So a lot of these scenes and whatnot from Stoker's life are going to make their way into his work eventually. When he graduates from college, he for a long time becomes just a civil servant. And it's kind of hard to find a proper name for his job, but just somebody who works in the courts and in the public offices, a lot of paperwork, a lot of record keeping, a lot of this and that. And you really see that in Dracula too. The fact that Dracula is considered an epistolary novel, meaning it's a novel that's filled with letters, journal entries. The novel of Dracula is heavily concerned with texts and textuality and records. I mean, even Mina Harker's journal entries, which form part of the novel, a lot of other people's journal entries form part of the novel. There's a field of study which is fascinating called the materiality of texts, which is a pretty fascinating field. It's the idea of how does the material of a text, the medium that we experience it through, how does that affect our receiving of the story? Or how does that affect the types of stories that you can tell through it, right? In a book, for example, you can really get into the interiority of a character, and we can spend a long time explaining and exploring what the character's thinking. You can't do that so well in a film, for example, because it's visual. You could just sit there and stare at the character's head while there's a voiceover, but you can only do that for so long, So, likewise, before there was a codex, a codex is what we call a book that opens and it's got pages, you can leaf through them. That's what, our modern day books are called. But before that, we had scrolls, right? And as you were rolling up unrolling one side of a scroll to expand it, you were rolling it back this way. Now, and we still have the words, the phraseology from that with the internet. We scroll down and stuff like that. But think about reading a work as a scroll. It can't be that long. You'd have to have a large novel like Dracula over multiple scrolls. You couldn't just go back and double check something that you'd read in chapter one. That would take all this re-rolling and rolling and rolling and trying to find the spot and then rolling back. I mean, that'd be a big issue. So the codex enables us to be at any point in the story in the narrative time at once. We can just have our finger in this one part in the past and jump to the future. If you're a monster, you can jump to the end and read the end. I'm looking at you, Al. But so the materiality of the text is has a lot of bearing on how the story's told. And Dracula being an epistolary novel, it's like somebody has compiled all of these. And as you read the book, you find out at one point they are concerned. The characters themselves realize, if we're going to beat Dracula, we have to put together the whole story, everything we know. And Mina's the one that compiles, her journal entries. Dr. Seward does a journal on his phonograph, recording his voice. So she, transcribes all of the recordings, of his journals and work and whatnot. And Jonathan Harker's travel log. They take snippets of the newspaper, telling the story of the Demeter when it comes into harbor and whatnot. Telegraphs that go back and forth have made it. So you get the idea when you're reading Dracula that, this could have been just like a big scrapbook that the characters actually put together. And that's fascinating because you can see, from Stoker's own past, his time as a civil servant, dealing with the paperwork and the meticulous records and all of that, that's something he would have been concerned with or certainly known how to do. We know from the research that he did on Dracula that he himself compiled a lot of different things to be able to tell this story. And there's that concern with record keeping. That's one of the themes of the book, which is fascinating. Mina Harker, is very clear in her journal entries. Like, I'm writing this part right here in shorthand because I need to practice my shorthand, because when Jonathan and I are married and he's a lawyer and she says she wants to be able to take dictations from him and so forth. So the idea of shorthand, the idea of writing in different languages, of hearing different languages, the technologies, recording your voice versus writing versus typewriting. She takes a lot of the handwritten journals and typewrites them, which is a big thing in that day. So the materiality of text there, and then just the importance of record keeping in terms of our humanity. That's one of the things that all of our heroes decide once they all get together and they all figure out what's going on. Van Helsing says we need a record. Miss Mina is going to, put these all together. She's typed up, she's transcribed and so forth. And they want a big collection, like a growing book, basically, that they can all stay on the same page, because each of them are going out and having little adventures as they're fighting against Dracula and achieving their plan. And they want to make sure that everybody stays in the know. And there's this focus on record keeping. And we need to keep a chronicle of our human struggle against this beast. And I think that's fascinating. There's something so human in that. Because journaling, keeping a diary, that was a big deal for a lot of people for a long time. Maybe certainly the more the leisure class that could write and had the time to keep a journal and diary. That's something that's completely fallen out of practice now. Now it's all done on social media. Even though people don't have the attention spans to write or certainly read, how much of everybody's life is documented on social media? Everything they're doing or going to, they make sure everybody on their social media knows about it. Or people will vlog and do video, diaries about their life and stuff like that, and I mean, it's all over the place. We're still, it's sort of a basic human need where we need to tell our stories. It makes us human. It's part of what makes us human, is telling our stories and hearing other people's stories. And we can do it to our detriment. We can do it to our health, depending. But that's something that's in Dracula. It's in the basis of the book, which I think is important to realize. So he's a civil servant for a while. Eventually, Bram Stoker gets a job, as I've mentioned before, at this theater in London, the Lyceum. And the theater is basically Henry Irving's theater. Henry Irving, we talked a little bit about it before. incredibly popular stage actor of the day, really the top of that world. Stoker becomes the stage manager for actors there, and that's his job. Okay, he's paid to be a stage manager, but in a lot of ways, he kind of becomes Henry Irving's sort of personal assistant, for which he's not paid. But you see this really interesting relationship between him and Henry Irving. It very much mirrors, in some ways, as I said before, the relationship that John Polidori had with Lord Byron. Remember, we talked about John Polidori being hired on as Lord Byron's sort of personal physician to travel with him. And Polidori immensely looked up to Byron, in a lot of ways wanted to sort of be Byron, wanted to be among his crowd, But Polidori just wasn't the writer, wasn't quite the thinker that Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley were, and so forth. And he was ostracized unfairly and horribly by Byron, treated pretty illy, at times. But eventually he's fired, and he goes on to write The Vampire, in which Polidori is very much basing, his Lord Ruthven character is Lord Byron. I mean, and that's what we talked about, that's where we get the Byronic vampire. There are different literary vampires in existence at the time, and Lord Byron was the one who kind of gave us, or Polidori through Lord Byron gave us, or Lord Byron through Polidori gave us the Byronic vampire. We see that same kind of relationship between Bram Stoker and Henry Irving. Bram Stoker looks up to Irving in a lot of ways, wants to kind of be not an actor, but associated with him in that in crowd. But Irving is a hard man. Some people say, "Oh, their friendship was so great." Well, I don't, have you read the records? I mean, they would be presented as friends, in public and whatnot. But Irving was a hard, brutal man who was demanding, and by all accounts, everybody who knew him and the records and whatnot, very narcissistic, in terms of just feeding off of other people. There's the vampire reference, right? Just sort of using people up in terms of for what he needed from them. And you could see that he certainly does that with Stoker. In a lot of ways, a lot of people have speculated that Stoker's even physical description of Dracula is basically a description of Henry Irving. In fact, Stoker also wrote a biography of Henry Irving. And if you look at the physical description that Stoker writes of Henry Irving, it's very similar to the physical description that Jonathan Harker gives of Count Dracula when he first meets him. So, this is one of our sources of the Dracula character, even before we get to Vlad Tepes. So it's pretty fascinating there, in that idea of just seeing ideas of Stoker's life that end up in the novel. In fact, when Henry Irving read Dracula, he was pretty mad, because he could tell. I think he could tell that Bram Stoker had based the character on him somewhat. Bram Stoker he was trying to protect the copyrights were weird back then. The stage adaptation rights were something very different from the writing of the novel rights. Like, basically, you had to actually stage a production of Dracula or of your work if you wanted to retain the stage rights as well as the book rights. This is why Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, was made in a stage play in America. There was a difference between the different countries too and whatnot. But anyway, before Dracula was published, Stoker, it was written as a novel, not as a play. He always kind of wished it would be a play, though. You can tell that. But he staged a dramatic reading of it at the Lyceum there shortly before it was published, just so he can say, look, this has been read, it's been performed at a stage, so he could retain the stage rights. And he had the actors there, and they just kind of did a dramatic reading of it, which took a long time. It's a long novel. I think it was like 4 hours long. And Henry Irving famously walked up and just announced that it was dreadful, and leaves it was like, wow, okay. As Jonathan Harker says about a paper pusher he meets in the novel, this is what, Henry Irving said, manifestly a prig of the first order. So not a great guy in terms of the way he treated Stoker. There is a story about they would do these meals after the plays at the Lyceum there with a lot of the authors and artists or actors of the day, And Hall Caine is a famous novelist of the day. He's not so well known today, but he's still an important literary creator. Oscar Wilde was a big friend of Stoker's that would come around. Thomas Carlyle. All these people knew each other. Dante Gabriel Rossetti was his neighbor. We're going to talk about him a bit, who's a pre-Raphaelite artist and writer. But there's one meal in which they're talking about roles that they can bring to the Lyceum so that Henry Irving can play, and Henry Irving's just played a lot of them, and they're talking about sort of supernatural roles that they wanted him to play. But he's already played everything. He's played the Flying Dutchman, he's played the Wandering Jew, he's played Mephistopheles from Faust, and it has to be a sort of a larger-than-life role if Henry Irving's going to take it on, And a lot of people think that this was sort of in Bram Stoker's mind when he's writing Dracula. This is a possible role for Henry Irving. It would have been, by all accounts, it would have been pretty cool to see him play it, or had he played it, if you'd been back then to see him play it, because apparently it would have been sort of tailor-made for him. But anyway, so there's the idea or the influence of his work there as well. I mentioned Oscar Wilde. Bram Stoker, sort of a little more quiet, reserved, academic kind of guy. I mean, he'd been, an athlete in college and whatnot, but he'd worked as a civil servant. He likes to keep his records. He likes to keep his papers, reads, writes, that kind of stuff. So the quiet, sort of bookish individual ends up marrying Florence. I keep wanting to say Fanny Osborne, but that's Robert Louis Stevenson's wife. Ends up marrying Florence. Forget her maiden name, but Florence Stoker, as she'd soon become. And Florence, by all accounts, was a gorgeous woman, very much a socialite. When Bram Stoker's courting Florence, he's actually courting her alongside his friend Oscar Wilde. So they're rivals for her hand. And eventually Bram Stoker, of course, ends up winning her hand in marriage, and they get married. But he remains friends with Oscar Wilde even after Florence chooses him over Oscar Wilde. The two of them remain great friends, even when Oscar Wilde is living in exile, from England. I mean, Stoker and him are still exchanging correspondence and whatnot. And you see that pop up a little bit in the book, and the idea that when you first meet Lucy Westenra, she's talking about, these 3 different proposals in one day that she receives. And all of those individuals, even after she chooses one of them to marry, remain fast friends. And in fact, that's part of the strong friendship that spills over into sort of the fellowship that ends up going after Dracula, Arthur Quincy and Dr. Seward. So we've got that part of his life kind of casts a gleam in the novel too. And we'll talk about, I'm not just going to say things from his life that show up in the novel. I think there's a reason I'm mentioning these things, because I think they show up thematically and they tie together in some of the themes of the novel that I'll eventually get to. Maybe not tonight, because time's getting away from us. Like I said, it's going to be a big talk, but we'll see. Now, in terms of what kind of vampire is Bram Stoker writing, the cool thing about Bram Stoker's Dracula is that it really is so original, even though the vampire is already out there. We talked about there's 4 different types of vampires in literature and in art at the time. There was the Byronic vampire, the Lord Ruthven, who was the aristocrat that feeds off of high society women. Okay, so that's it. And you can see that in Dracula. There's a big influence of that in Dracula, definitely, the Byronic vampire. There's the other type vampire, and Christopher Frayling points this out quite well, who are sometimes you'll find stories or accounts where the vampire is like a beast or a flower or something like that, some othering kind of creature that, feeds or sucks blood and whatnot. And you can see that a little bit in Dracula, just in terms of the enormity of his power, all the forms he can take. We'll talk about Thalaba the Destroyer here in a moment, but taking the form of just mist itself, So there's that. There's the folkloric vampire, which is the one from the stories of, Bulgaria, Austria, Romania, all these places. Folkloric vampires they're the zombies, people would, the folkloric vampire is supposed to come back and feed upon their families, basically. And families would go exhume the bodies of their recently dead, and they didn't know much about physiology back then. So they see these bloated corpses, when their corpses are bloated from the gases, as the decomposition takes place. But they didn't know. They think this is a corpse that's gorged itself on blood the night before. So they would put a stake through their, dead ones in the grave. And the idea was to stake them to the ground, keep them from being able to get up, put a stake through their heart to stake them to the ground to keep them from getting up. That's where we get the idea eventually of just a stake through the heart for a vampire to kill them. Things like garlic, was sometimes be used to dress a dead body, in terms of the odor, or there are different conflicting stories here and there about it, but that came from the folkloric vampire, which Bram Stoker takes a lot of this from. He takes the idea of the stake, he takes the idea of decapitate, chopping off the head. This was something they would do to corpses. Takes the idea of the garlic and whatnot, so that folkloric vampire. And then finally, the dangerous woman. And we haven't really talked about Carmilla yet, but maybe we should spend a few moments on this. Like I said, we're definitely not going to cover all of Dracula tonight. It's definitely going to at least be a two-parter. So come back next week for the rest of it. We still got some more time to talk about it tonight, though. Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu was a very famous vampire novel of the day, and certainly would have been read by Stoker as well as The Vampire by John Polidori. We'll talk more about John Polidori's in a moment here. But Carmilla is about this woman, this young girl, vampire, who preys upon this other young girl. And there's absolutely, if you want to talk about homoerotic tensions, Carmilla, it's 100% in there. In fact, you get the idea that this vampire, a little bit more overtly than something like Christabel, this vampiress is infatuated with this girl of like 18. And manipulates things to where she's kind of taken into her home and being guarded by her father for a while, and is feeding off of this young girl. So there's an idea in Carmilla of the vampire as the sexual predator. Not only the sexual predator, but the sexual predator who can choose to slowly drain a victim. In fact, in Carmilla, when they're explaining things in the end, some of the people around, chugging that soda, trying to burp in the microphone. Some of the people around have been attacked and died instantly. And they explain that the vampire in Carmilla can attack and kill instantly just for sustenance, just for food. But when they really are infatuated with somebody, when they have a crush, so to speak, they like to just play out that infatuation by slowly draining that person over a long period of time. And we see that in Dracula. The way he feeds on Lucy at first and then tries to feed on Mina like that and so forth. So this is something that Stoker took from it as well. The idea of Dracula as sort of a sexual predator. What I mean by sexual predator, I don't mean that, Carmilla wasn't like raping her characters. And Dracula himself isn't actually having sex with these women. You can maybe read through the lines and try and think that. I guess it doesn't technically say he doesn't. But that's not what I mean by sexual predator, because it's not, I don't think it's intended by Stoker that he's actually, having sex with these women. The idea is that it's a very sexual in nature. I've talked about this before in previous Halloween videos. The idea of the vampire coming in through a young girl's window when she's in bed, she's partially dressed. He sees part of her skin exposed. He sees her décollage, the throat and chest area. The vampire becomes aroused. His fangs start to grow. Part of his body starts to grow at the arousal of this, and he penetrates his victim, with his fangs. And there's a flowing of blood. There's the exchange of fluids. It's a very sexual thing. And Stoker himself was not. Stoker would have said that he's in favor of censorship, especially if it gets too sexual or something like that. So you can make all kind of speculations. Did he know how sexual this was, or did he feel like the sexuality of Dracula was enough under the layers to be okay? It wasn't overt pornography by any means. But to the best of my knowledge, Dracula is the one that brings in the idea that the victim, in order to be turned into a vampire, has to drink the vampire's blood as well. I don't know if this is anywhere else. Varney the vampire says that if a victim is bitten over and over and over and fed on by a vampire over and over and over, then eventually, if they die from that, they could become a vampire. But to the best of my knowledge, and I could do a little more research before I really state it boldly, Dracula's the first one that brings in the idea that, Dracula can feed on you, but if you drink his blood, that's when you become a vampire as well. And that's what we see with Lucy and Mina and so forth. So there's that idea as well. Now, Stoker would have worked in the theater, in the theater world. When John Polidori's The Vampire came out, earlier in the century, big hit, people thinking Lord Byron wrote it. There was an immediate adaptation to the stage. There was a lot of different stage adaptations of it. One of the most popular is what was it called? The Bride of it was the vampire, the bride of the I forget the name of it. The Bride of the Highlands, or the Bride of something like that. It was set in Scotland. And the reason they set it in Scotland was the particular theater that was adapting it had a overflow of Scottish kilts and whatnot, of Scottish costumes. So they just decided to set the whole thing in Scotland. I forget the name, but you can look at Vampire John Polidori play version. It's The Bride of something. I'm blanking on the name right now. And there were a lot of different stage adaptations of it. After Polidori died, we talked about him killing himself. He his sister was married. He ended up becoming the uncle of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who is a wonderful poet, a great artist. He and his sister, Christina Rossetti, I think that's her name, a great artist, great writer rather. They're labeled in the movement of the Pre-Raphaelites. They're called. They want to go back before all of this Enlightenment stuff, and they want to go back to the classics, even before Raphael and that kind of idea, in terms of writing and art and everything like that. And Dante Gabriel Rossetti, so he would have been nephew by marriage to John Polidori, the writer of The Vampire. And Dante Gabriel Rossetti is the next door neighbor of Bram Stoker. And again, right now we're just looking at, we haven't even gotten to really looking at the themes of the book yet. I'm just talking about things from Stoker's life that show up in the book, because we're going to tie them together to the themes of the book in a moment. There's a story from Hall Caine, the novelist friend of both Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Bram Stoker. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he's a poet. He had a wife who passes away, dies early in her life. And the story is that Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote a book of love poems for his wife, and he buried them with her. Now, this is back in the day when you didn't have, copies on your computer of everything you wrote. So this copy of love poems was it. That was the love poems he wrote, and he buried it with with his dead wife. Beautiful romantic gesture. Okay, so she's been buried for a couple years or whatever. But then the story goes that Dante Gabriel Rossetti wants to maybe publish those poems, in honor of his wife. Not taking it back from her, but he thinks, that they're buried in the casket with her, which is a beautiful gesture. But if I took them out and published them as just sort of a living tribute to her. So he gets permission to have her body exhumed. And they exhume her body, and they take off the lid of the casket, and they see that her corpse is just so well preserved. Her golden red curls are still, her body's just so well preserved, and she's holding the book on her chest where he, placed it there before she was buried. And he reaches down to take the book, and some of the curls fall off, of course. And then immediately, because something, maybe the casket was just sealed the right way or whatever, but because of the outside air hitting her body, immediately it just starts to turn to dust, and decompose quite quickly before their eyes. That's the story. Who knows if it's true or not, but it is a story that was told to Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker heard this story from his neighbor, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, from his friend Hall Caine. And so this is, something else you see showing up in Dracula when they go to, to Miss Lucy's tomb, and they see her just looking even more beautiful in death, than she was at the end of her life and so forth. So you see a lot of these things showing up in Bram Stoker's life, in the Dracula from Bram Stoker's life. And I think that's always a good place to start if you're really going to understand a novel. I think you have to start. I see Andre Hernandez thinking I'm looking too much into this. I don't think so. I think if you really want to understand a novel, if it's a masterful work that is stuck with culture, and it continues to influence culture, especially, for something like Dracula. It's still with us now and today in the, you know, 2024. And this was, 1880 or 1897. I forget the exact date it was published. So centuries later, or a century later at least. I think it's important to look at the things that came from the author's life, and because that's how you'll really fully understand the themes in the book, and how they apply to the culture of the time, but how they continue to apply to culture throughout ages, and why they're still with us today and so important to us today. It's like Stephen King. If you've ever read Stephen King's novel or autobiography On Writing, it's part autobiography talking about his life, and he points out a lot of the things that happened in his life that you see show up in his work. And then the second half is the real nuts and bolts of his thoughts about writing and language and prose styling and so forth. So it's, you use your experiences for that, and we'll definitely get to that. Or we'll wrap it up some more. Maybe I'll just kind of wrap. We're at the hour mark. I'll just wrap up by saying a few things here. I see a super chat from Eldridge fan first. Let me get this. Come on. There we go. Vampires should always go for the left side of the neck. It's the sweetest and richest just after it has passed through the brain. Taste those dreams. Interesting. Is that from a book that you drew that from? That's a pretty fun fun way of thinking, the thought there. There is something to be said too for the idea of the fangs in vampires. That came from Varney the vampire. The fangs, seeing the fangs. In film, it was first done with Nosferatu, the sort of rat-like fangs, the two fangs in the front. It wasn't until Christopher Lee's Dracula that we saw the traditional fangs, on the sides, like, these wonderful traditional, fangs of Dracula, which are just so aesthetic. I mean, that's the way that we think of vampire fangs now. There is some work that's being done on the folkloric vampire, and how the ideas, or how it was explained that the folkloric vampire would have originally fed on you. It wasn't that he had two fangs here, because you think if your two eye teeth, I mean, it's horrible to think about. Think about if you actually bit into somebody with your two eye teeth, it'd be hard to get your teeth out, and then feed, because you'd have to bite so far down to actually draw blood. Anyway, they would say that the fangs of folkloric vampire was one top eye tooth and one bottom eye tooth, so that they would pinch the flesh in between and pierce it, almost like a piercing. And then you could easily pop your mouth out of that. And, I know, wonderful to think about, but that's just the evolution of the idea of fangs, coming through there. So I talked about the literary types of vampires that are available in Stoker's day. And I'll end with this: the actual works that he wrote. These are the ones that he would have drawn from. I get you, Andre Fernandez. I figured you were just messing with me. I was joking when analyzing an author's sexual mindset. It's like trying to analyze George R.R. Martin's mindset. Oh man, I would not. Oh man. Oh, heaven help the poor literary scholars who are one day going to try to analyze George R.R. Martin. Never mind. But in terms of work, like I said, he got the idea of the sexual predator and the slow draining of blood from Carmilla the Vampire from Sheridan Le Fanu. And that's a great work. If you're interested in vampires and want to read literary vampires, read Carmilla. It's really fun. It's not that long, and it's pretty fascinating. It's a pretty fun read. Varney the Vampire, like I said, I mentioned before, this was published in like the little penny dreadfuls, and you can get the hardcover, but it has to come in like a freaking box because it's so crazy long, because the writers were getting paid by the word that they wrote, and it was just serialized. So at any given time, it was just a little pamphlet in somebody's hands, and they just kept this story going forever. So if you can get through it, good on you. But it's there are some important things that Stoker took from Varney the Vampire: the idea of fangs, the idea of coming into a woman's bedroom, to feed on her, the superhuman strength of the vampire that Dracula has. This came from Varney the Vampire as well. So some interesting things like that. Thalaba the Destroyer was an epic poem that was lauded. Actually, St. Cardinal Newman lauds it as an interesting tale of good versus evil. But there's just like one little line in Thalaba the Destroyer where he goes to like a cemetery, and I think, if I remember correctly, that he meets this vampire who tells him like the people that he's trying to save will eventually become vampires and so forth. Um, but anyway, you see the vampire in mist. The vampire forms itself in mist and then comes out, what's the word? Embodies himself, incarnates out of the mist or whatever. And we see that, show up in Dracula as well. From the actual vampire, by John Polidori, he got the idea of the aristocrat because Dracula is a wealthy man moving in these circles, feeding on women of higher class, of society and whatnot. And then, of course, the from folkloric vampire, we get the idea of shape shifting. One of the things we're going to talk about next week is the idea of the vampire now as we know it. We know Dracula is distinct from the Wolfman, but vampires and werewolves in terms of folklore were kind of, the lines were all kinds of blurred between the two of them. And we see this in the novel Dracula. So that Stoker drew a lot from folkloric vampires, but he even drew some from a folkloric werewolf as well. And it's interesting how it happens. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde is a big reason why we see that split, and we see werewolves becoming quite distinct from vampires. But we'll talk more about that next week. But yeah, the idea of the shape-shifting, the garlic, the crucifixes, to fight against vampires and whatnot, the staking to the ground and so forth. We haven't really talked much about it tonight. We'll get more into it next week. But Dracula is an immensely religious book. It's a very Christian novel. I would argue it's a very Catholic novel. Now, Stoker himself wasn't practicing Catholic, but he grew up in Ireland, and he certainly would have had, Catholicism around him. Van Helsing, our main hero, the main mentor of these heroes, is devoutly Catholic and is honored, or it's treated very sincerely in the novel as a devout Catholic. It doesn't, pick fun at him in that. In fact, his Catholicism, the work of actual crucifixes, are the actual consecrated host, the Eucharist, the bread that's been consecrated and is the body of Christ. Those are the things that repel Dracula. So these Anglicans, who don't believe in all of these, things, are having to like, there's a wonderful line. And I'll end with this. I know I've said I'll end with this before, but I promise I'll end with this now. There's a wonderful line at the beginning of the novel. Jonathan Harker's on his way to meet this Count Dracula to, help him buy this land or whatever. And some of the natives in Romania and whatnot, or Transylvania, are giving him, one lady gives him a crucifix. If you must go to that castle, please take this. Take this for your mother's sake. And they talk about praying to the Virgin. Here, take this for your mother's sake. And he looks upon this crucifix and he says, I've always been, once he's in the castle, once he realizes things are a little off and he's kind of worried, but he doesn't know exactly what's going on. He's looking at this crucifix and he says, it's strange. I've been taught all my life to reject things like this. These are superstitious or whatever. The iconoclasm sort of the enlightened, even Christianity of the day. And he says, yet I find such comfort in staring at this and holding this. And he said, I must think on this more, if I'm ever getting out of here or whatever. And it's, and we see that show up a lot because there's power in symbols, and we see that as part of the ways that Dracula is fought against. So anyway, we'll go on and on and on and on. I can go on and on and on. I'll stop now. But like I said, definitely going to at least be a two-parter. We'll see how far we get next week. Heck, it might be a three-parter. Part of it's because this is like the meatiest, I think, novel of the three literary masterpieces that have come from these archetypes come from: Frankenstein, Strange Case, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula. This is the meatiest one. It's the longest one, but it's also the one that I dearly love the most. And I think there's just so much to draw from it. I think it's also probably the most popular one, certainly in terms of you guys. I think you guys really love Dracula, at least from what you said. Probably more than the others, or at least as much as the others, Who knows? But, yeah. So, pop into the chat here a little bit as we wind down before I get ready to go. The Imaginative Hobbyist said, do you think it would be fair to describe novels such as Dracula and Frankenstein as like the literary equivalent to found footage movies, replacing the camera with journals? That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's fair. Because, yeah, even Frankenstein is written through the letters of the boat captain. I forget his name. It's all written through his account of Victor Frankenstein's account to him. And Victor is piecing all this together from his, past and journals that he'd written, certainly, and whatnot. It's not the epistolary novel that Dracula is, but yeah, it's from that as well. Yeah, I think that's fair. I never thought about it that way, but that's fair. Let's see. Leah Plus says, "Will you do a brief bio of Anne Rice and how episodes in her life led to her writing Interview with the Vampire?" You know, I do really like Interview with the Vampire. I think the Vampire Chronicles get a little cumbersome and kind of collapse over their beneath their own weight eventually. But I think Interview with the Vampire is darn wonderful. I think it's a classic. I think it's an important step in, or an important stage anyway, in the vampire popular culture. I don't know. Maybe I'll do some more digging into her life and stuff. That'd be interesting. Maybe I will. It's about time I reread Interview with the Vampire, to be honest. It was good. It was good stuff. I got so tired of the vampire Lestat as soon as he took over as the protagonist of the Vampire Chronicles. Part of the charm and the appeal of the Interview with the Vampire to me was Louis, the one that you're actually listening to, the one that's actually interviewed. And Lestat just I mean, there's so much. There's only so long you can sit there and listen to a narcissist talk about himself and his life and those around him. And some people love Lestat, so I'm going to be, yeah, I'm not trying to get in any trouble there, but I'm just saying for me, that's one of the reasons that the Chronicles after that kind of lost steam a little bit. All right, Michael Skimbody, we got to talk about the Joker before the night's over. Did you like the Bat in the Sun fan films? Patient J. I haven't seen this. I know of Bat in the Sun. I know of their fan films, but I haven't seen that. At least in those two fan films, the Joker looks, acts, and feels like the Joker, but curious if you've ever seen them. I haven't. I have seen some Bat in the Sun stuff. I'll have to look those up. There is a real correlation between Batman and Dracula. I mean, Batman is a gothic detective, and he comes from the gothic literature, and a lot of his villains. I mean, tell me the Joker isn't influenced by Renfield in the Asylum, definitely a lot of that. So, even movie-wise, I mean, Renfield himself, the character in the movies, was influenced somewhat by Conrad Veidt, The Man Who Laughs, and of course, The Man Who Laughs was visually the inspiration of the Joker when they first created the character. So, yeah, a lot of that's there. Andre Hernandez says, "I don't mind." Oh my goodness! Oh, he's talking about George R. R. Martin. Said thoughts on Adam Sandler Dracula from Hotel. Oh, Adam Sandler was the voice of Dracula. Yeah, was it you, Andre Hernandez, who mentioned? Somebody mentioned Hotel Transylvania a few streams back, and I was just I'm on the fly live streaming here, and I saw Hotel and I thought Transylvania 65000. I don't know why. Hotel Transylvania 65000. And that's what I responded to. I was like, oh, yeah, it's such a funny movie. That's great, blah, blah, blah. But the person was talking about Hotel Transylvania. I need to watch it again. I just bought the DVD the other day. I found it at Goodwill. And Alyssa, my daughter, liked the idea of watching it with me. So I think we're going to watch it this week coming up. I don't know if I've ever seen the whole thing all the way through. So it'll be fun. So I'll get back to you next week, or ask me about it next week. I'll make sure I watch it this week with Alyssa. Ace Mowick talking about Bat. Yeah, I remember seeing some things from Bat in the Sun that I really did not like. But I think if I remember correctly, I've seen some things I did like too. So I don't know. I have to find those ones. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Eldritch Fan says the Necroscape books had the Father of Vampires. What are the Necroscape books? Not sure what those are. But great to hang out with you guys. Hopefully you found something of interest in my rattlings on and ramblings. Like I said, we're just covering the groundwork now. We'll look at more of it. We'll start looking at the actual novel itself next week. Hopefully we'll get through it all next week. We'll spend a whole other time. I'm working through the novels first, and then eventually we're going to get to the film adaptations. So we're going to spend a whole another series of weeks on the Universal, slash Paramount with Jekyll and Hyde, that when they first came into the public consciousness film version, where because that's what sticks with us throughout the century today. That's why they're still so ingrained in our consciousness today, because people don't read books. What's a book? Ooh, gross. So we'll talk more about that as well. Long time to go between now and Halloween, so it'll be fun. Great to see you, Slav, channel member. Just shout you out there before I wrap up. Long time no see. Hope you're well. I am well, thank you. I am well because my wife bought me some Count Chocula, which I'm going to dig into later, and things are going well. So thank you guys for hanging out. Appreciate it. Appreciate you
chatting and the questions and everything. We'll try and get to more. Maybe we'll do like a question and answer, a Q&A about the monster archetypes, because the last handful of streams have just been me sort of lecturing until the end. Maybe we'll just sort of do a Q&A where people can just ask questions about it, or we can talk more in depth about this or that aspect that might interest you in it or whatever. That might be a good idea. So thanks for watching, guys. I'm going to go ahead and call it there. But till next time, keep enjoying and digging deeper into the true blue monster fiction you love. Thanks for watching.